My original idea was to do a follow-up to my top 18 Master System games. There were quite a few comments stating that I left out a few games that should really have been on the list. However, those 18 games were composed from my childhood memory and omitted games that I'd played later on in life. So with that in mind, I have been slowly going through the Master System catalogue, capturing footage and trying them out for the first time to see if they still hold up today, in order to form sort of an alternative modern list, which I will be putting together as soon as I am happy with the amount of the library that I've experienced. I'm kind of trying to play them at a casual pace, as to not just rush through them for the sake of making a video, to try and get more of an organic experience. The only problem with that is A, it takes a lot of time, and B, inevitably, you will discover a game that you didn't know about that warrants a more in-depth review than a mention on a top whatever list. And that's where Psychic World comes in. Knowing nothing at all about this game, I had to go off the box art, which looks somewhere between the original Phantasy Star and Space Harrier. As the game begins, we are treated to some anime-style images making up a rudimentary cutscene, setting up the plot. Twin sisters, Lucia and Cecile, are working as an assistant to Dr. Navik, who is conducting research on extrasensory perception, or ESP as it's known. Bad luck ensues as a section of the lab spontaneously explodes, setting free all of the monsters that were held captive for experimenting, who decide to take Cecile along with them on their escape. Armed with an ESP booster, it is up to Lucia to get her sister back. Each level in the game is introduced with a short skippable scene played out in the sprite graphics. These remind me of Alien Storm, which has a very similar intro to each level. However, these don't just follow the journey of the flying monster that took Cecile. Instead, they act as a mild tutorial for the level that you're about to face, alluding to pitfalls and enemy types. As with the majority of games at the time, Psychic World is a side-scrolling action platformer. When you start off, you're equipped with a short-range projectile attack, headband, and nothing much else. Impressions are left a little lackluster right off the bat. The setting doesn't really seem overly interesting, and a third of the screen is taken up by your status bar. You'll fight your way through enemies that have all too familiar patterns and jump over some minor hurdles. Things begin to get a bit more interesting rather quickly, however, when you pick up your first power in form of a shield. It took me a little while to figure out how exactly to use this ability. A combination of pressing down and holding the jump button allows for what I thought at the time to be a radar on the bottom left hand of the screen, opening up as a selectable inventory of magic and weapons. It won't take too long until you find yourself free from the open setting and into a cave where we have some different enemies and actual platforms to traverse. First time playing this, I found it to be rather difficult. Enemy patterns, especially sub-bosses, need to be memorised in order to successfully dispatch them without too much error. Each level is comprised of interlinked screens, which quickly open up to some surprising scale. You will often begin by running past a number of power-ups which are unobtainable from your starting position, which you have to backtrack to in order to acquire. I really like this. It isn't just shooing you to the next screen, and it gives you time to consider whether it is worth traversing a more dangerous path in order to collect a few ability boosts. Speaking of boosts, you will quickly grow and upgrade your arsenal. Each weapon can be leveled up each time you collect the weapon icon, and these will transform from a single slow shot to a rapid free. Things become much easier with fully upgraded weapons, and the game has a unique way of allowing you to manage the pace of your power. Pretty early on, you will acquire a spell that allows you to restart the level. At first, I found this to be infuriating, as I didn't really know what it did, and when I used it, it destroyed all my good progress. However, running through the level for a second time laid way to all the power-ups that I had found the first time round, meaning that on this run, I was twice as powerful due to your pickups not resetting when you used the spell. There is no limited amount of times you can do this, and it is down to your own personal preference and resilience for repetition, but more importantly, it removes the annoyance of dying, as you are more likely to reset your progress on your own terms, power-ups intact, than risk going to the next screen with a sliver of health. I'm not entirely sure whether this was the intention of the ability, and the ice level in particular starts with a fire weapon, so it would be counterintuitive to not spend 2 minutes rinsing and repeating to get yourself maxed out. As the levels go on, so does the complexity in their layout. Depending on the environment, the exploration switches from strictly horizontal to vertical screens, and this really helps to keep each level feeling different. Along with setting layout, each level also has its own unique obstacles that must be overcome. And I think it is this that was a cherry on the cake for me to a game that I was already enjoying. In total, you have 5 primary weapons. 2 are similar and look like some sort of mind blast. Another later on stops enemies' actions, and you also get a fire and ice attack. Usually, elemental attacks are simply in place as sort of a rock, paper, scissors approach to fighting enemies. See a monster in a fire level, you're probably going to use whatever ice or water based attacks you have. Where Psychic World differs is with the practical application to each element. You wouldn't think that the ice attack would come in handy on an ice level, but it soon becomes your best friend due to its environmentally spoiling abilities. Scattered throughout the level, you will see certain patches of water that can be frozen to form platforms. Alternatively, your fire attack can be used to remove them should you have built yourself into a corner. I didn't really think too much of it at first, until I thought back to the kind of games that were generally around on the Master System. You would usually get one unique gameplay feature per game, but this had multiple ideas all operating perfectly well. A modern gamer might think nothing of it, but coming from a time when most games would have stopped at jumping and shooting mechanics, I found this to be impressive and the kind of game that I wish someone had put in front of me back when I was little. To coincide with the weapon upgrades, we also have enhancements to our spells, and these are accomplished in the same way, by picking up multiples of the same icon. As the levels go on, spells will play more of a role, most importantly the shield spell. This makes you invincible to most attacks for a short amount of time. The more upgrades you acquire, the longer you can remain invincible for, and this is a necessity in the late game. You also have a spell that can attack all monsters on screen at the cost of a big chunk of your ESP power, and a spell that allows you to fly. I realise that I am calling them spells, when really they are psychic abilities, but spells are a bit easier to say. The game is comprised of 5 main levels, but that isn't to say that it is short. It probably took me well over an hour to get through the first time, with dying and restarting levels, and there is a part towards the end that sticks you in a maze-like loop of sub-boss fights, which can be pretty easy to get lost in. Visually, Sidekick World isn't too groundbreaking. Most environments are made up of a few simple and similar colours, and standard enemy designs range from acceptable to a bit pants. There are also a few odd designs going on with the sub-bosses. I don't particularly know what this big poo is, but it's hard as nails. Bosses, on the other hand, tend to be quite big and detailed, and this is helped by how much real estate we have on the screen at one time. Compared to other platformers, we are relatively zoomed out and have quite a lot of each screen to explore. Our character sprite is also a decent approximation of the images seen in the opening scenes, being basic but retaining that anime aesthetic. I think it's obvious at this point that I like the game. In fact, I really like it. But it wouldn't be a review without finding a few things to pour some scorn on. First off is the weapons. Other than their level manipulating effects, they're all kind of the same. They all shoot straight and upgrade to a row of 3, so it never really feels like you acquire a new arsenal. And usually a new weapon is picked up at the start of the level that it is appropriate for, so it can come off a bit of a cheap way to get you to repeat the power boosting ritual. Enemies are also a bit hit and miss. Mostly they are incredibly easy to run through, the difficulty of them only stemming from how awkwardly they block your path to a hazardous environment. That criticism can kind of be turned on its head though, as one of the things I like most about the game is how each screen becomes sort of a puzzle that you have to plan how to get through without getting hit. Bosses are also a tad too easy, and the last boss fight doesn't really pose any threat, but these are only a few shortcomings in a game that I have completed at least 3 or 4 times now. And that is really where my recommendation comes in. I had never played Sidekick World until a few weeks ago. I didn't have any nostalgia for it, and I hadn't even heard of it until it popped up on eBay when I did a search for Power Region Master System games. But after only a few minutes of playing, I was hooked and saw it right through to the end. It kicked my ass for a short while whilst I got used to the controls, and discovered that using the shield spell in quick succession would restore some of my health, but unlike other 8-bit games, I didn't get fed up of it and move on. This is partially down to the music, which has an above average composition and doesn't have that childish vibe that a lot of the platformers had on the Master System. Most of all, it made me a little bit disappointed that I never got to play this the first time round, but it also made me happy that there are games out there that are old and can still be enjoyed without having prior knowledge or nostalgia for them. I do have to mention that Sidekick World was originally released on the MSX2 Japanese home computer a few years prior. This version is a lot less forgiving and the levels are arranged differently to how they appear on the Master System, and in general it's a tad less accessible. There was also a Game Gear version released, and this is actually a pretty faithful port. The main difference being the on-screen scale is far more up close and personal, but other than that I'd say it's perfectly playable. The game even pauses when you go into the inventory screen, and I really like that. Sidekick World was a real pleasure to find, and one that will definitely crop up on any list of Master System games that I would recommend as still being enjoyable in 2018. As always, thank you very much for watching, and don't forget you can check out my movie podcast, Plotcast UK, where me and Dan review films scene by scene, available here on YouTube or over on SoundCloud for listening on the go.